Colleagues, if I may interrupt the conversations that are going on, but I promise you that after Siphokazi has done her bit, we will go back to some of those conversations. And I think the interesting thing is that there will be even richer conversations after the presentation. So welcome, colleagues, welcome visitors to STIAS. Welcome to all the friends of STIAS to the first public lecture of this semester and the fifth in the series of public lectures in the 2025 year. I should also note that the 2025 is the silver jubilee year for STIAS. So we're celebrating 25 years of existence. And so everything that is being done this year is in that celebrative mood. And so the fellows that are giving their seminars and the public lectures, it's all part of this celebration of 25 years, but also a challenge that those that come 25 years from now should find STIAS. And so it's a challenge to me, it's a challenge to my colleagues, team, and of course it's a challenge to all you fellows, because it's usually when people look up our website and look at the fellows, that is the attraction. So please don't let me down. But so far in the last 25 years, it's really been a great pleasure to be part of this journey. And we hope that we will round it off in November with the Literature Nobel Symposium and a couple of other things that will happen then. We don't want to put it in December because South Africa takes their December break very seriously. So everything you have to do it in November. So we'll crown it at that time, and then we'll see how it proceeds. So thank you very much, Siphokazi, for accepting to present as the first in this semester. And I should note that we structure the public lectures in a way that they represent the structure of the fellowship program, because the fellowship program does have individual fellows, it does have uMkhonto fellows, and it does have artists in residence. So we try and give the public a sense of what it is that we're doing at STIAS. But for those that we ask to present the public lectures, we just throw a dice. So the other fellows don't take Siphokazi to task how come that she's the one presenting. So we simply say, here are the individual fellows, let's take one, and here are the uMkhonto fellows, let's take one, and here are the artists in residence. And those are the three public lectures that we have in the semester. Last year we were a bit more adventurous. We had a fourth one because the person that was presenting the fourth was part of the Lancet Commission, and we thought that we should take advantage of that Lancet Commission report that was coming out on reproductive health. And so we asked the fellow who happened to be in residence to speak, rather than going to Geneva to launch the report. We had a sneak here for the public in Stellenbosch. We also encourage that the speaker is introduced by someone not in the respective cohort of fellows, and so we thank Uhuru here for accepting to take on that role, and I will introduce her shortly. Usually we do 45 minutes of presentation, and we allow for the Q&A for another, and so aim to finish by 17:30 and have the reception just outside here. So when the questions go on, remind the people that are asking the questions that there's something waiting. But for the presenter, they may go over the 45 minutes. So before I briefly introduce Uhuru to ask her to introduce our public lecture speaker, I wish to make one or two comments, and I assumed that everybody knows me, So my name is Edward for the visitors, and I'm Professor Edward Chirumira. I'm the director of STIAS, and also Professor Extraordinary at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Stellenbosch University. But I think most of the work is here. The board of directors said my contract has 20% of my own work. I struggle to claim that 20%, but I think I'm okay. So we will have another public lecture on the 18th of September, and Olga Sengupta will lead us in that, and is working on the project, The New Internationalist, The Life and Times of Rhoda Bernard Pearl. And then on the 23rd of October, we will have the third public lecture in the series given by Josephine Larson. She'll be coming early October, so she'll be part of the fellowship program here, and she will take us through a three-dimensional view of exploding stars. We just have to make sure they don't land on Earth. Then on 3rd of November, we will start the Literature Nobel Symposium, and it will be the 5th in the series of the symposia that we've held here. And usually they start with a public session. So all of us will be invited to that public session. That is the beginning of that symposium. But this is on our website as well. And we're really privileged that the two co-conveners are colleagues from the English department at Stellenbosch University. But also the third convener is the Nobel laureate Abdulrazak Guna. And we will have two Nobel laureates in that symposium. So I think it's going to be a blast. And we have all the writers, poets, all here for a whole week, so it's going to be really a buzz, and I can see that these two here are going to be very active at that stage. So if we don't have enough of them today, we will follow them up in November. I'm also pleased that the public lecture has actually drawn a healthy attendance. We have a list of people that have confirmed in person, 79, so I think some people are still on the way. You know, it is term time, so the traffic down there is crazy, but we hope that they'll be here. And you do have 82 people online. So there are a lot of people that are expecting. I'm not setting you up, but I'm sure you'll leave. And then our senior program manager, Christoph Poe, will moderate the Q&A, and he might introduce some of those individuals online. So I want to welcome particularly the fellows, the former fellows. Once a fellow at STIAS, always a fellow. So I can't see fellows in the midst here, and you're most welcome. Now, if I may briefly and very briefly introduce my colleague Uhuru. Uhuru Parafala is a writer, scholar, activist, and conceptual artist. She's a senior lecturer in the literary studies at Stellenbosch University, where she teaches Black consciousness literary, visual, and sonic cultures of the Black Atlantic, and poetry as a modality for repair. She's published the poetry book on Mine, 3 times, Mine, in 2023, and also a philosophical book that she's also published that touches on the Black arts movement. She heads the project Recovering Subterranean Archives, which researches South African cultures in exile, particularly in the US and Scandinavian countries. I've always wondered why the Scandinavian countries and US, but I know that, of course, there's a huge diaspora in Boston, for example, so I'm sure you have more people than you can interview in that respect. with the aim to rematriate, republish, and relaunch them. Her current book project investigates Black and indigenous ecological practices in Southern Africa and Brazil. And I think most importantly, she's an Isolomso Fellow of STIAS. And on that note, Uhuru, please.
Thank you, Edward, for that generous introduction. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this edition of the STIAS Public Lecture. As already stated, my name is Uhuru Kwabaphambili. It is my distinct pleasure today to introduce the speaker, Professor Siphokazi Magadla, who is Associate Professor of Political and International Studies at Rhodes University, where she teaches and researches war and militarism in Africa, the armed struggle in South Africa, women and South African foreign policy, and African feminisms, gender, and citizenship. In reading her book on Guerrillas and Combative Mothers, which I have here and which I highly recommend, I was moved by the critical attention that Professor Magadla has extended in her research on South African women exile returnees and those who fought from the inside. Her approach brought me back to the fact that to pay attention is to attend, is to tend to the particularities of experience, the textures, minutiae, interiorities, and sensorialities of those who lived history, and is to care, edging closer to them in their retelling. I listened into their telling in this book, the accounts of our mothers as they made homes and history. But I was also attuned to Professor Magadla's witnessing, her dutiful presence in the space, which left me with questions. What kind of posture did she embody? How did she occupy her body in the space to allow these women to profess the sacrifice and the love, to confess the violations and betrayals? Perhaps it is because of my own engagement with exile returnees that made me wonder about this. For it is a difficult endeavor to ask those who've lived the unspeakable to return there, to language the unspeakable. This is a question of method to which Professor Magadla's magisterial work offers generative pathways. In reading her book, I was deeply attuned to her sense of what I can only refer to as regard, in which to regard denotes both to respect and to contemplate, to consider and to care, and also to sympathize. What does it mean to us as scholars to adopt regard as methodology? What is a sympathetic orientation to our work? I am left with a new understanding of what Toni Morrison offers in her rich rendering of the source of self-regard. That in attending and attuning so deeply to the lives and loves of our mothers, we are extending that attention and care to ourselves. In meeting them where they are with consideration and contemplation, we extend ourselves that grace. And we need grace in our intergenerational ambitions. We need a sympathetic ear, a presence, witness. Professor Magadla's work invites us to deepen the politics and poetics of care, of tending as methodology into scholarship. Her work in the social sciences is shaped by personal experiences and stories. She grew up in a household with a father who had left the South African National Defence Force in 1996 before he was 40 years old. Her mother was a psychiatrist nurse who regaled them with stories of recently retired soldiers in her ward who, following their demobilization, suffered from debilitating mental illness. It is these stories that now direct her attention, that shape her politics of attending to the guerrillas and combative mothers in her work. It is for Professor Magadla a personal journey. It is research as lineage work. She draws on the power of these women's stories to texture the everyday of this thing we call history, to color the quotidian lives of revolutionaries, and to language their structure of complex feelings as lovers, mothers, friends, and political subjects. In engaging with her work, and I'm sure that this will be evident in this evening's lecture, we are reassured that the work that we do in the academy is deeply important, that social science research does not have to be rendered in verbose and data-driven language that alienates the novice and layman. And perhaps more importantly, that the research we conduct has the potential and capacity to hold us, that we can find love, care, consideration, and deep contemplation for ourselves and our history as we attend to our traumatic pasts that have brought us here today. This is research as lineage work, which is a source of self-regard. This evening, Professor Magadla's address is titled From Meadowlands to Libya, Love, Family, and the Betrayal of Freedom. Please help me welcome to the stage Professor Siphokazi Magadla.
Thank you so much, Dr. Palafala. I'm really moved. I'm really moved. It is an honor and a joy to be part of the 2025 STIAS cohort. Thank you to Professor Chirumira, Dr. Christoph Poe and your team for your support and really exceptional hosting. Although it is cold, not so much today, cold and rainy in Stellenbosch, I think for many of us, we will remember these 6 months as an epic summer of our career. A summer in the ways that Makhosazana Xaba writes in her poem, Summer. Xaba writes that this is a summer of things we can touch, a summer of women in high places, making meaning. As this conversation is about women in the armed struggle against apartheid, it is also a summer of songs composed in blood, turned with guns, and arranged in conversations. It is a summer of songs I sing in swelling volumes. Thank you everyone who's here and online. I see familiar faces, and I expect to see soon my PhD supervisor and former head of department and mentor, Professor Paul Bischoff, and his wife, Winshet Bischoff. I thank you, everyone. I want to thank Dr. Palafala for this generous and deeply moving introduction. I remember attending an online launch of Malibongwe, the collection of poems by ANC women in 2020, and feeling very emotional because the late Belinda Martin, whose guerrilla name was Gloria Mdungwa, had mentioned this collection in our interview in 2014. Thanks to Uhuru's hard work, this collection was published for the first time in South Africa in 2020. It had been banned following its first publication in Europe in 1981. In these poems, we are able to feel the pain, violence, anger, and despair that women felt living under apartheid, and the courage, love, and conviction that women had in the belief that apartheid would be defeated and a new world would be possible. I opened Guerrillas and Combative Mothers with Mabuza's words in this collection, where she says with conviction that the pain of apartheid will not repair before the sharpening of our spears. With this line, she captures the feelings of the women that I will speak about today, who left the country going into exile to receive military training with the aim of returning to defeat the apartheid regime. In talking about love, family, and betrayal of freedom, I will narrow my focus to the literature on the anti-apartheid struggle, and specifically to the literature on the armed struggle. I've just seen Paul, my supervisor is here. By the armed struggle, I refer to the violent strategy adopted by the National Liberation Movement after their burning in April 1960, following the Sharpeville massacre. This period that is known as the turn to the armed struggle in both literature and in public culture was marked by the founding of the African National, the ANC's military wing, uMkhonto with Sizwe, and the Pan Africanist Congress's Azanian People's Liberation Army in 1961. Next year will mark the 65th year anniversary of the founding of these military wings. In Call Me Woman, the seminal memoir by Ellen Kuzwayo, published in 1985, Kuzwayo opens the book with a letter written to her by Deborah Nikiwe Machoba in September 1978, from her detention cell in the Johannesburg fort. Machoba sounds upbeat as she assures Kuzwayo that because of the letter and the gifts that she had sent her, she's feeling brighter, fresh, and alive. She then laments the pain of the denial of the basic human rights, such as fresh air, sunshine, essential vitamins, communication, love, movement, and security. Kuzwayo understood well the conditions of the Johannesburg fort because she had been detained there for 5 months in 1977 at the age of 63 and released without a charge. Kuzwayo recalls the pain of hearing the conversations of young girls of 12 and 18 years old whose prison cells were separated by just a wall from hers. She says that it was an invidious position at my age to listen to these young girls talking amongst themselves about their very terrifying plight. She goes on to say, at other times I could hear them singing Sunday school hymns, their favorite being Amazing Love. It was a heart-rendering situation. Some days, hour after hour, I sobbed in vain when the conversation of these children penetrated my cell. if I had my way, I would have fled from hearing those innocent voices. Just imagine how they yearned for justice, peace, and love in the country of their birth. While Khuzwayo was separated from the children by just a wall, she did share detention with 3 younger women. One of these women, fellow detainees, was Thenjiwe Mtintso. Khuzwayo describes Mtintso as a woman of small stature but strong moral fiber. Mtintso would leave South Africa in 1978. Mtintso would leave South Africa in 1978 and end up being the ANC's chief representative and MK's regional commander in Uganda by the time Khuzwayo's book was first published in 1985. Writing about masculinities in the ANC and their conceptions of revolutionary morality, Raymond Sartner quotes Che Guevara that a true revolutionary is guided by feelings of love, which tended to supplant or downgrade the personal for the love of the people. But Sartner highlights how young men and women in the ANC's military wing were inspired by figures such as Chris Hani, who embodied an ethic of love that recognized the individual needs of young recruits, even in the context where liberation fighters were expected to undermine their own emotional and intimate needs for the broader task of national liberation. In her memoir, Guilty and Proud, an MK soldier's memoir of exile, prison, and freedom, Marion Sprague explains that Chris Hani was loved. There are few people who were loved in the struggle the way that Chris was loved. This is not the romantic kind of love I'm talking about. I am talking of Chris, the MK cadre, comrade, commander, and MK's national commissar. In The Quiet Activists, a memoir of love, purpose, family, fighting for justice in South Africa, there is no separation between the love of national liberation and romantic love for Peter and Bibi Present, who decided to get married before going into exile in 1986 at the age of 22. While holding hands, walking in Strandfontein Beach in Cape Town, Peter informs Bibi of his decision to leave the country to join the ANC and MK, and his desire for her to go with him. Bibi, there is something important I must tell you. I have decided to join the ANC and MK. I'm currently making arrangements to leave the country. This decision is final and nothing will change my mind. My wish for you is to consider going with me. If you do decide to go with me, we will have to get married because I have been advised that this will assist us in staying together while in exile. If you decide that you cannot go with me, I will understand. And because there's no guarantee that I will ever come home, this will be the end of our relationship. After getting married, Peter and Bibi would use their honeymoon as a cover story that they would be traveling across Southern Africa, while in actual fact, they would be receiving military training in Pango in Angola. The story of the Presence offers an important account of the intersection of self, love, love of nation, and romantic love that cannot be separated. As we will see below, for many of the women liberation fighters, the choice between national liberation, love, and family was always tenuous. But love in all of these forms was present even under the unstable transnational context. Women who left South Africa as young girls, most of them as teenagers, became girlfriends, wives, mothers in exile. This expansive love shaped their visions of national liberation and of a democratic South Africa. 30 years into South Africa's democracy, men's accounts of their contributions dominate academic and public culture accounts of anti-apartheid struggle and the armed struggle. As I show in my book, MK women have been the most vocal about what they consider to be a deliberate brushing out of women in the armed struggle, out of the history of liberation in this history. Tenjwe Mtitso too has proclaimed that the story of women in the armed struggle has not been told, and that it must be told by women who were in the armed struggle. Elaine Utenhalter describes the South African anti-apartheid autobiographical writing as the work of heroic masculinity that entails giving oneself to the struggle and reforming oneself in that process. This work of political struggle is lived exclusively in the public realm, which must be supported unquestionably by the private sphere, mothers, wives, girlfriends, children. She goes on to argue that in men's autobiographical writing, the support provided by a feminized portrayal of home is always complemented by male camaraderie, deep bonds of friendship formed in adversity. In her reading of memoirs written by women who were active in the 1950s Congress movement, Rachel Sandwell argues that reading these memoirs as texts, not indices, but motivated political texts that present a contested vision of a South African nation, yields richer insights into women's relationship with nationalism within the South African liberation movements, and new insights into the ambiguities of nationalism. Importantly, Sandwell points out that centering women's work let us see that women were active participants in fantasizing a certain uneasy national freedom predicated on certain ideas of Black and white women's equal access to shared space and to the benefits of citizenship. What this literature on the armed struggle reveals is that there is more to the struggle for liberation than military power and victory. There are layers of humanity, care, complexity that women's stories gives us insight into, not only into the struggles of the past, but in the struggles of the present and future. The more women that get to write about their roles and their ideas of national liberation, the more we would be able to surface continuities and ruptures in women's thought across time, especially how the banning of the national liberation movements shaped women's ideas of violence as a necessity for the achievement of liberation. From this project, we hope that we will see more collections and full memoirs that reflect the fullness of women's ideas and actions. Thus, pulling together chapters written by women former liberation fighters from 3 military wings of the former national liberation movements is a project of recovery, shaped by changing material and ideological dynamics that inform which aspects of the story are told and how they are told. The reality of death as this generation watches their their peers' transition places renewed urgency in how women want to be remembered and the ways in which they want to speak back to what their comrades have written about them and their movements. It was at the funeral of Thokozile Mazulu Chane where this collection, Prodigal Daughters, Stories of South African Women in Exile, was conceived in 2009. As the book's editor, Loretta Ngobo, points out, in telling their own stories, these women agreed that it was not only important to recall our history in exile, but to capture it for posterity as well. Recent memoirs by MK women, such as Ruth Mandile's I Survived, Evolved Against All Odds, Sikose Mji's On the Stage of Time, and Sparg's Guilty and Proud, for example, surface the tension of revisiting the ideas that motivated one to choose a liberation movement that is today facing the prospects of its own death. Early visions of a future post-apartheid liberation sit side by side with the disappointment and anguish of deferred freedom and the intimate reality of racialized and gendered inequality and violence. Our project follows similar ones, such as the Zimbabwean Women Writers' collection of interviews with former women liberation fighters, women of resilience, the voices of women ex-combatants, and mothers of the revolution. In this project, however, we did not want to just interview the women liberation fighters. We believed that once they hold the pen to tell their own stories, interesting and unexpected textures of the story may be surfaced. We hope that from these chapters, full book-length memoirs will follow. From some of the excerpts that I will share today, one can see the difference in how the story is told when the teller is the owner of the story, versus entrusting it to a researcher to arrange how the story is told. Of these 17, and that's all of them there, liberation fighters, 10 belonged to MK, 2 to AZANLA, and 5 to APLA. These accounts of experiences, especially of the women liberation fighters of APLA and AZAPO, also provide a small window into the distinct cultures of these liberation movements, especially the unstable and chaotic nature of the PAC's exile period. In bringing these veterans together to write their memoirs, we knew that the knowledge of the armed struggle literature would not be enough. We needed a facilitator who shares this history, who was committed to women's writing, and we found that in Makhosazana Xaba, who is a former liberation fighter, writer, and 2024 STIAS Fellow. Between 2022 and 2024, we held 3 writing workshops, multiple oral and individual feedback sessions between ourselves as the editors and the veterans. And from this process, we have just under 1,000 pages of handwritten first drafts, which were transcribed, revised over several drafts, some of which we are still finalizing. The themes of this lecture emerge out of this process, which we hope will provide an example of the intellectual, material, and psychological infrastructure and methodology necessary for women to write about their lives. Their stories reveal missing missing parts of the South African liberation wars, a liberation heritage that we believe is necessary in the ongoing struggle for justice in our country and our world. I'm sure we recognize a fellow, Thambile Masola, who's part of this project, the other editors, Babalwa Makotwana and Puleng Sekhalo. Piskikua argues that love as revolution names the present in terms of its particular social and political ills. It recovers the past in its haunted memories and imagines the future in its hopeful striving for something better. What becomes clear from women's writing is the profound impact of the 1976 Soweto student uprisings in their politicization and in their recognition that if the state was armed against thousands of young people, they too needed to be armed. For Jumaima Modia-Khotla, the Soweto uprisings were personal because of the impact of the violence to her community and the killing of her friend's brother. The date was the 18th of June, 1976. I was on my way back from the university, which was already the time of the June holidays, when we heard about the student uprisings on the radio. We were on the train from Alice to Johannesburg. I was an ordinary student at Fort Hare University, doing my first year in Bachelor of Commerce. Arriving at home, my mom took me around my area, which is Zone 5, Meadowlands in Soweto. There I noticed the devastation that was caused to the buildings, like the municipality beer hall, which is just around the corner from my place. The debris was all over the place. 15-year-old Hastings Ndlovu was one of the first casualties of the Soweto uprisings. He was the little brother to her friend, Granny Ndlovu. That with emotions quite high and outrage at the killing of innocent, defenseless school children, that a group of us who were friends of the members of the Ndlovu family decided that we were going to undergo military training abroad. We were going to acquire arms in order to avenge our lost brothers and sisters. Modia-Khotla would leave South Africa with two of Hastings' sisters, Thandi and Granny Ndlovu, to join MK. The title of her chapter in the book is called False Bottoms in Suitcases, because after receiving military training in Angola, Modia-Khotla joined the Ordnance Department, where she was trained in the camouflage of weapons and explosives through the use of false bottoms in suitcases, as well as using tins to conceal things like hand grenades and explosives. Malapane and Tsiki Memela Motumi evoke love as both metaphor and an ethic in their politicization at this time. Malapane thinks of her politicization as being unable to dodge Cupid's political arrow that he incessantly kept throwing at me. She recalls how she and peers at Meadowlands High School referred to their classroom as Makerere University because of their admiration of this Ugandan university. Little did she know then that in 1978, she would be receiving military training in Uganda as a member of the PAC. Tsikimemela Motumi recalls giving her first speech as a student at Holy Cross High School in Soweto and declaring to her peers that although suffering from the yoke of oppression by Balthazar Foster, we shall, in the spirit of love and dedication, lay down our lives until victory is won. In this project, we have had the rare opportunity of chapters written by twin sisters, Nziki and Dodzi Memela, who joined MK. In her chapter, Dodzi Memela writes about how the Soweto uprisings made it clear to them that they are the agents of change for the future that they desire. The freedom that they wanted would only happen through them and by them. She says, "We were willing to be the agents of change that would bring the future we all wanted. In fact, we believed that we were the future, and also we knew that it could only happen through us and by us. The South African police hippos and mellow yellows armored vehicles roamed the street. We were unafraid, very defiant, and their guns and tear gas could not stop us. We were not afraid of death." Dodzi Memela's chapter is titled Infiltrator Rose, because after military training, her specialty was to infiltrate senior MK members into South Africa from Swaziland. Among those she infiltrated, Abeki Cele, Matthew Posa, Ibrahim, Mek Maharaj, Siphiwe Nyanda, and Jabu Shoki. Nontsikelelo Gabela was doing her junior certificate at Meadowlands High School during the Soweto uprisings. She says that during the student uprisings, I was schooling at Meadowlands High School doing my junior certificate. The principal of the school was GM Simelane. My political consciousness began around 1975 through mobilization by teachers such as Zapania Matopeng, popularly known as the Lion of Azania. The story of June 16 is a tale of many stories told in different angles. For me and my colleagues, we were recruited by the Black Consciousness Movement, and we told our story from the eyes of Black consciousness, which was close to Pan Africanism. Our vision was to reclaim our African identity. Gabela joined the PAC, where she would end up receiving military training in Tripoli, in Libya. Her experience in Libya shows the lack of clear planning from the PAC's leadership and the precarious conditions that PAC recruits lived under. In the book, we have two accounts of PAC women's experiences in Libya, Gabela and Thandi Mohale. Gabela's chapter also sheds light into the low status that women had in the PAC, including those that had been in exile since the 1960s. The chapters of PAC women liberation fighters cast new light on the experiences of a group of 20 South African nurses who came to Tanzania in 1961. After Tanzania gained independence, the country faced the problem of British nurses who began to resign, preferring to return to Britain rather than work for a Black government. President Julius Nyerere approached Owar Tambo, who was in exile in Dar es Salaam, to help recruit South African nurses to assist Tanzania. While the PAC women appreciated being welcomed into exile by women who had been there for almost 2 decades, they were also alarmed by the low political status that the Nightingales had in the PAC. This set the tone for their own sense of vulnerability in the party, where they had to be vigilant about their physical safety and political futures. Gabela continues to say, "What was also surprising for me and my colleagues in the whole situation was the status of the South African women who came to Tanzania as professional nurses after its independence, who are known as the 20 Nightingales. These women did not have any voice, and they were regarded as PAC sympathizers. The whole 1 year we stayed in Tanzania made us vigilant, especially on women's issues, because the ratio of women was 10% to 100%. We had to safeguard our interests. We were even afraid in social relationships with men because of their numbers, lack of organized health facilities such as wellness centers and family planning. In her chapter, Elizabeth Ramuaka describes the PAC president, Potlako Lebalo, as boisterous, manipulative, divisive, demeaning, and had no respect for anybody, especially women. She describes his mood during the afternoon political discussions known as Parliament in Tanzania. The star of Parliament was Potlako Kitchener Lebalo, popularly known as PK. He was the leader of the PAC and called all the shots. He would arrive at Parliament dressed in a dashiki, a loose-fitting, colorful African printed shirt, black trousers. He always wore trousers, black medium heels, almost like the one worn by dancers, which made that kwa-kwa sound when he walked. And of course, his famous pipe in his hand. He also had his pistol tucked on the side of his trousers. We could see it because his dashikis were not fully stitched on the side. One wonders what the motive was to show off his gun, as he had personal bodyguards with him all the time. 3 of the 4 PAC women in the project, Ramuoka, Joyce Mutema, who arrived in Kampala in Uganda in 1978, provide fascinating encounters with Idi Amin and the horror of being caught up in the war between Uganda and Tanzania, which led to Amin's removal. Ramuoka writes, remembers watching from their building. She says, one morning from the balcony of our room, we saw a battalion of soldiers marching in and artillery machines rolled towards the city. It was an easy capture. The Ugandans had retreated there, and there were few shots here and there. On that very day, we had earlier seen some Libyan soldiers jumping from the rooftop of the highest hotel in Kampala, which was opposite our own. They had been fighting from there. I think they realized that Kampala was captured. They decided to commit suicide rather than be captured. Libyan soldiers were fighting alongside Amin's army. I can never forget the scene. It still plays in my mind 45 years later, like it happened yesterday. For many of the women liberation fighters, the plan of receiving military training that would be followed by a return to South Africa to confront the apartheid regime would never be realized. Instead, as the chapters detail, women had to make fast decisions about what life in exile would look like for themselves and their families. Many of them chose to equip themselves with degrees and diplomas at universities in Zambia, Tanzania, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, some of them in the United States. Getting qualifications and new jobs often came hand in hand with starting families and raising children. While women liberation fighters speak often of the joys and challenges of having children in the tenuous context of exile, where there was no guarantee of living in the same place as one's partner. Naomi Ribbon Moshodi, for instance, writes about how her first child was conceived in Lusaka while she lived in Berlin and her husband lived in Ghana. My husband was in Ghana representing the ANC youth and students at the All Africa Student Union. I was representing the women's section in the Women's International Democratic Federation in Berlin. In July that year, we met in Lusaka, and that's when it happened. We had not discussed children yet, and the fact that we were working in different countries was no motivation to procreate. However, that is when I conceived my first daughter. We are glad that their chapters do not rush over the process of falling in romantic love, even in the context where that love ends in separation, divorce, and sometimes death. Women's memoirs also surface rare accounts of how they negotiated romantic love in the context of military life. I will read Nomsanqepe's account in some detail. She says, the Pango camp was smaller than Kakulama, with few chosen comrades to undergo this training. In Pango, I met 2 female soldiers that had been there before me. That was comrades Sizwe and Linda. They were older than me, and I learned a lot from them. The day after my arrival in Pango, I went to get water from the well. I took 5-liter bottles, and as I was walking down the footpath to the 52 steps down well that we used as a source of water, there this man was coming towards me. He was short, slender, with legs slightly bending outwards, walking tall, with a chest out and open arms. As we passed each other with just a hello, it was as if there was a magnetic attraction that pulled us towards each other. Excuse me, can I accompany you to the well? He asked. Of course, I will appreciate that, I responded. It was as if I knew this man. He asked my name and I told him I was Thabo, lying of course. I don't know why, but it turned out his name was Thabo too. What a coincidence. When I heard his name, I immediately corrected my name and told him my name was Thabisa. We walked together to the well, small talk, but it was as if we knew each other from home. Normally, we were not allowed to reveal our real identities, but Thabo and I did. We went down the 52 steps and got me the 2 5-liter bottles of water. We sat for a while on top of the well and chatted, and then walked back to my tent. This was love at first sight, and the rest is history. Sharing stories about romantic love in the context of military action surfaces a more holistic understanding of people's humanity, even where war can and does dehumanize. It alerts us to the ways in which the battles that were fought for in the past and the freedoms we continue to fight for are also for the freedom to love. Finally, the flip side of love is heartbreak and sometimes betrayal. Love of self, the nation, and the family is the radical opening up of the heart to the joy and loss. In a time of war, it means fighting for survival of others, as one fights for one's own survival. It means walking the line between what is good and what is evil, while exposing yourself to a reimagination of what these mean. The women whose accounts reveal the minutiae of their times in the armed struggle teach us that as much as love for the nation could drive them to acts of unthinkable courage, it also revealed the brutalities and woundedness that shape relations between those who fight for liberation. These relations form continuities of our gendered struggles today. Elizabeth Ramoka captures the sense of anguish that many of the women feel about the failures of the post-apartheid of post-apartheid South Africa. None of them regret the decision to sacrifice their youth for the achievement of national liberation. So this sense of an incomplete freedom was a subject of Thandeka Qubule-Mpeki's article in the Makhanda newspapers, the Grokot's Mail, last week. In the article titled, "Freedom Like Love is Never Complete," Qubule-Mpeki reflects on the gains and losses for women today as we mark the 69th anniversary of the Women's March of 1956. I want to conclude with Qubule-Mpeki's reflection, as I like her formulation of what it means to think of freedom and love as ongoing projects of struggle. Qubule-Mpeki writes, "It seems to me that while each generation receives something profound, an inheritance of courage, progress, and possibility, freedom, like love, is never complete. There is always something withheld, something still to be fought for. Sometimes it is not linear, a linear march or ride forward. A new generation often has to deal with the effects of regression and democratic backsliding and the erosion of rights previously gained through struggle. Every generation hands something to the next in the form of values, victories, freedoms, won in battles. But there's always some sort of a deficit, some kind of a democratic, economic, social, ethical deficit that becomes a burner cancer in the consciousness of subsequent generations. So what's often overlooked is that the most important inheritance may lie not in what is passed on, but in what is left undone, what is yet to be struggled for. Thank you.
Siphokazi, thank you. One senses this project is important for many reasons. Some obvious reasons, like bringing unheard or brushed aside voices to the light, but some less tangible reasons, which has to do with, I guess, our very identity. Thank you for bringing that. I wanted to acknowledge that some of the members in the audience apologized that they would leave a little bit early because Professor Louise de Tooy has an inaugural lecture this evening. So please don't hesitate when it's time to move. I also wanted to thank all those who joined us online. We'll keep the questions and the discussions to those who are in the room. But those online, please do use the chat functions. If you'd like to send any messages to the speaker, we'll make sure that Siphokazi receives them. So with that, I'm happy to open the floor. Any questions, comments? I've got two, one at the front here and then next.
No, thank you. It's more a comment than a question. Firstly, I would like to thank you for this lecture, as we were told. Firstly, I'm a son of the underground. My parents were in the underground, and also they were born in the underground, with my grandmother being in Tanzania, leading uMkhonto Sizwe, the real uMkhonto Sizwe. And this is so refreshing for me to also hear this talk at a space such as Stellenbosch University. So I'd like to acknowledge that also from you and say thank you for telling these stories similar to my grandmother's story and my grandfather's stories. You would probably know Lulu Johnson, who is my uncle, who is the 1994 ANC Youth League president. So this is really just refreshing for me to also see this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We have Sizwe.
Thank you so much, Sipho. I thought that was a very fascinating lecture. My question is on the theme of betrayal, and I wondered if you could complicate and unpack that a little bit. Because when you talk to these women and they're reflecting back, you also have to be aware of the tyranny of hindsight. The struggle wasn't fought with one thing in mind. For example, if you think about Kenya and Zimbabwe, you could say that the struggle was really about land. I would imagine it wasn't the same in the case of South Africa. Land, yes, was important, but people were not looking for one thing. Maybe you could say freedom was the commonality between the different organizations that were pushing that were fighting for the struggle. So when they look back today and feel betrayed, it creates an impression of two things. One is that there's a timeline within which visions and dreams must be realized, for example. Yes, the country has been free for 30 years. The danger of emphasizing betrayal is that it creates this expectation that things must have been achieved within this timeline. The second is this idea of what it is that the struggle was about. You know, if you look at the Freedom Charter, for example, they talk about a non-racial, non-sexist, you know, essentially South Africa as a meeting place and a celebration of diversity. There have been stages that have been undertaken that points to the achievement of some of those ideals that were envisioned, for example. And so when I hear things like betrayal, yes, it's very easy to say that so-and-so has been betrayed. But was there a shared one thing that everybody says, this is what we wanted and has been achieved? Thank you.
Sure.
Shall we take one more, Siphokazi? We have two, actually, Chris and...
Yeah, thank you so much, Sipho. That was really a fascinating lecture. You know, when I read the topic from Meadowlands to Libya, but I think when you now wrapped it up and closed with the citation, I think now it became very, very clear in my mind what we are really talking about and addressing. Now, I think over lunch hour some time back, I once told you about in these whole stories about freedom, struggles, you know, there are two constants one cannot separate. That is the interest and betrayal. So I don't know how you reconcile these. I would have wanted you to up a bit the aspect of interest in your lecture, but maybe that is for another time, because in Kenya, this is what has destroyed us. All the liberations we have had, I think right now we are talking about the fourth liberation of the Gen Z. But in between now, even I've started seeing that interests have now started creeping in, and the betrayal of the cause is taking an overriding space. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You can take those three, and then we'll come back for next round, starting with Ndudus.
Thanks so much, Christoph. All of these questions and comments are really very useful, and I might not give sort of a detailed answer now. Some of them are useful for us as we continue with this project. But I really welcome the first comment around, you know, sort of the progeny of these liberation fighters. There's a thesis I recently marked from Wits. I'm hoping that she'll write a book project out of it. But she was interviewing also the children, it's in some cases grandchildren of liberation fighters. And part of what she's thinking through is, what is the inheritance? And so even there's sort of this tension between, you know, some young people say, well, what have we as a family and as a community inherited? There's nothing tangible that we can point to. But I also loved her conclusion, where she also attempts to think about the intangible, you know. So I would like to see sort of more projects like that from you all who live with these generations of liberation fighters. So thank you. And then on the comment about sort of this expectation of what was to be achieved, I think it's a very useful comment. You know, maybe combined with Chris's comment, my sense actually, the betrayal is the change in values. So what Sadhna talks about in terms of this revolutionary morality. So watching the people that you sometimes watch people die in front of you, now caring about self-interest. You know, that is really the sense of betrayal. It's not so much that they expected the undoing of colonial and apartheid legacy in 30 years, but perhaps the expectation that that collective mentality was going to continue for as long as it needed to continue. You know, so that's really how I think about it. So, you know, I didn't mention his book today because I was emphasizing on women's memoirs, but we had at Rhodes Ambassador Mji, whom I mentioned, and Utatu Usijake. His book also came out in 2024. It's called Fighting for My Country. And he was one of those early founders of MK. And he talks about, you know, the Freedom Charter as this living document that guided, their actions. But of course, I think, I mean, this was always contested. And he writes in fascinating ways about how they debated about Marxism as shaped by the Chinese and the Soviets. So there were always this sort of a robustness in terms of what ideas are shaping what we think. You know, so I think part of what has been lost is the ability to contest ideas, which for me, I hear as perhaps a sense of betrayal from one's own peers. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Next up was Duduz, and we'll take two further ones.
Thank you, Siphokazi. You know, I must say, you know, hats off for being able to tell those stories that even some of those who lived those times, because of grief, they've gone silent. And as I thought about it, I thought, you know, there's so much I would like to ask, but it's quite unfair for you to actually express and articulate some of the things that they went through, because you've done such a huge work to actually express some of those experiences lived. It then brings me to a very, this one will be your opinion and obviously to sort of expand into it. You see, our African languages and Guinea languages are so expressive in a way that goes beyond the language that you presented this in. Some of it is said in silence and it means 1,000 words. Some of it is said in tears, in song, and in so many other things. And my question to you is, or rather comment that I would like to hear from you, how are you able to bring all of those different types of expressions into a language that is told by people either as a second or third language, but to an audience that is going to be able to appreciate the way we did to your talk? Thank you.
Tough.
Thanks. Next question.
Thank you so much, Siphokazi. I really enjoyed this talk, and I love the stories. I was just telling my friend over here that it just inspires you when you hear how defiant they were, and just wanting to fight. And I think maybe that's something we need to hear now. I think my question is linked, similar to the previous speaker, in terms of, I feel like when I was listening to this, I was also listening to a particular worldview that I think they were educated. It's like a line that you sort of see in South African history. Those who are fighting in the struggle tend to be educated in the system of whiteness in many ways. So I wonder if the stories they also tell are a particular type of story that sort of mimics the precarity that comes with whiteness, right? And I think you see that if you go back into colonization and people coming to take other people's land, and they are homeless too, right, within this context. It's a form of homelessness that's playing out. And then when people go into exile, they also become homeless, or they're in between. And so I wonder if this kind of retelling, it also mimics this kind of worldview that I sometimes cannot recognize it as someone who grew up in a small village in Limpopo, where this language doesn't really exist in this way. And I think what he's saying about our Nguni languages and how we express certain things, I wonder if they adopted new ways of expressing themselves that mimic a particular worldview, and if that is captured in your work as well.
Okay.
Thank you. Any third one? Yes, Vicky on the side there.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I have two small questions. I enjoyed the narrative from Elizabeth Ramaoka. Yeah. And because I believed she was being honest, showing how the men were being, controlling, and how he walks with that sound. I think maybe that's what many of them were going through, but never talked about it. But I'm wondering, did the women let it go, let it slip like that? Did they endure the kind of control from the men? Or were there some agentic steps that they took as women after leaving home, and then you're out there, and then you're still facing something that wouldn't be? So what did they do about it? And then the other one is, you talked about what I wrote here as women to women issues. The way they expressed the feelings they had about, for instance, the nurses that they brought that seemed not to have a voice. They were not really active. So I'm wondering, maybe the nurses were not motivated the way these ones are. So they were being blamed for doing something they didn't even intend to do. Yeah, so maybe if you can throw more light about this woman-to-woman experience that they had. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Okay, thank you so much. Again, some of these questions we'll just have to continue thinking about them. We said to the elders that, one can write in whatever language they want, and in fact they can mix up the languages as well, which some of them do. I'm trying to see, but still of the 17, most are writing in English, and I think it's this dilemma that also all African writers face, in that they want to be read, and the language that sells, it's English, right? But it is something that I'm thinking about. I don't care if someone takes on this idea, but I think we need podcasts by some of these women, because the majority of them, they are grandmothers. And so someone, for instance, like Ambassador Mtitso, is a fantastic storyteller. Even Kuzwayo, Mam Kuzwayo says this in the book, that she was hilarious in prison, That is really how she is. She's in her 70s now, to tell stories that can be changed into children's books. And I have this dream of sitting with many of them. Maybe STIAS will help me with this, help us with this, to bring them into a place where we surround them with their grandchildren to tell the stories in their languages that can then be played across our radio stations, which more South Africans listen to those radio stations than they listen to the English ones. Any interview I've done on this work that has been impactful is the one I did on uMhlobo Wenene, where many of my family members were listening across the country, because I have millions of listeners. And so I am taking Du and Gabaza, your questions, comments, as an invitation for this kind of work and for others to do it, because part of it is also we are running out of time, you know, because as I said, a lot of them, they are watching their peers, they are burying their peers, you know. So I think for me this is just the beginning. You know, we have more to do, and I'm hoping that in their memoirs, perhaps now that we've done this, they can trust themselves with playing around with language. I mean, one of the things about watching Mam Kosi facilitate this was watching the transformation of someone who knows they're a veteran, and then you see their mind switch to becoming a writer. So I'm not just a veteran, I am also a writer. And that's a long process. I mean, we talk at lunch all the time about the struggles of writing, and we write for a living, you know. And so it's keeping all of those things in perspective, I would say, you know. But again, with language, you know, in my book, I really was grappling with what does it mean for these liberation fighters who did win the war, who did change the world, to be like other South African women, poor. And I kept thinking of the word that my mother used all the time, uktabalaza. You know, she was saying, uktabalaza, my girl, you know. I am going to hustle. Like, that is real life. And that's how I made sense then of this transition from umzabalazo, from struggle to hustling. You know, so these terms are absolutely powerful, you know, and it's something that one is thinking about. And then to Victoria's question, you know, I think definitely more research needs to be done on PAC women. So in a way, we have a fuller account of the experiences of sexism and what women did about it in the ANC. So here, these are sort of the, we are still trying to make sense first of what happened and then what changes. I mean, some of these women did leave the PAC. One of them says, I left the PAC and it's confusion. But most didn't. You know, I don't want to give the impression here that many of well, at least of the 4 that we have in this group left. Not all of them did. But what I do say to research, you know, what is exciting for me at this time is that I get emails from mostly young black women doing PhDs in this area. At Rhodes, one who did her Nomza Montombela, I believe she's online, who did her PhD on the women's sections of the PAC, and the ANC has just joined us at Rhodes in sociology. And so when they contact me, I then connect them to each other and say, you have to know each other so that you can share ideas. And I look forward to more detailed work on the PAC, on the AZANLA women. You know, I had a discussion with 3 young black women filmmakers who are doing a documentary on MK, and I said to them, when are you going to get to the PAC women? You know, why must we replicate this erasure, you know, that's been done at the state level? And so, yeah, I hope that makes some sense.
Thanks. Take 2 more questions, Charles and Amanda. Charles on the end. Yep. Charles had his hand up. And then
Thank you, Zippo. That was quite a moving and provocative story. 2 questions. One, you've referred to them as former liberation fighters. From where you sit in terms of the work you've done, would you say the liberation struggle is over? Number 2, the theme of betrayal has come out, and I know my colleagues have responded to it. Would you say do we still have any voices around to address the betrayal? Are they still around? Or yes, we have former liberation fighters? Thank you.
Sure.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you for a beautiful, yeah. I don't know what to call it, a talk, an evocation. What I wanted to ask you is, you just mentioned the point about connecting people with each other. And that just brings up for me the question of, to what extent is this work connecting with the work on women who've experienced this in other liberation movements, other struggles, particularly in Southern Africa? And related to that, moving into the present, what role does that wider networking, connecting of women who've experienced this together play in critiques of the present, critiques of what is going on through the sort of trajectories of liberation movements after independence in various places? And the third linkage with that is, what role do African feminisms play in making sense of all of that in a wider sense, beyond South Africa or beyond any particular national question? Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll start with Charles. Are they retired liberation fighters? Is that, or they've checked out? I would say not. I would say not. Many of these veterans remain active, whether within their parties or outside. And part of the, what keeps us doing this work is that we know that they are still there and they are working hard. In September, we are going to have a webinar to mark the 100-year birthday of Ruth Mompati. We've been waiting to see, is her own party going to do something? One of the founders of the Federation of South African Women, FEDSO, one of those women who organized the march in '56, and perhaps Paul will attest to this. We have a seminar room in my department at Rhodes, named after Ruth Mompati. And many times I ask the students who have tarts there, do you know who this woman is? And the people that will be in that conversation are some of these veterans. So they are invested, not just their history, but in the history of the women that made it possible to speak about South Africa's gender struggle, South Africa's gender architecture in particular ways. So for me, they are a voice of conscience, I would say. And in fact, I think for many of us, knowing them and sort of how ordinary they speak of their lives, it frees us to say, when we are looking at this deepening insecurity in this country, a deepening crisis, a looting and emptying of institutions, that we must be encouraged that these ordinary women who were teenagers did something about it. We must be able to say, we have done something. And so that's in part why I really like Sister Ndega's formulation. Herself an anti-apartheid veteran, by the way, who's training a new generation of journalists to say it's always complicated. What we inherit is always complicated, but what we must push against is this idea that we don't have an intellectual and a liberation heritage, because that's part of the erasure. It's the denial of that heritage for people that are still living, And then Amanda's various questions. And so yes, there are these regional conversations. So when I was doing my PhD, You know, one of the people that encouraged me, I'm not sure if you know Yolande Boka, she's a political scientist based in Canada. She was doing field work in Namibia on women liberation fighters. I have a student who did her MA on Joyce Mojoro, and one of the things when we had a colloquium on African women's intellectual traditions in 2020, in fact, during COVID, I showed a letter that Joyce Mojoro, in fact, it was a book signed by Joyce Mojoro to Ruth Mompati. And part of what we're trying to uncover, you know, are these connections. I was at the Forte Liberation Archives, and it's amazing to me to look at even the voice of women, just how transnational it was, you know, in ways that perhaps we are not anymore. But I say that to also say there is also this moment in the academy where there's a language of what African feminisms or black feminisms look like, decolonial feminisms. I mean, I'm not sure we've had a moment like this kind of robustness. And I like that there's deep contestations amongst African women about what feminism is. And as I said to you, you know, of course, we have scholars like Nzengu who say, can African women untangle feminisms out of histories of colonialisms, like other frameworks, you know. So even African women have to grapple with that, you know. But it's certainly a conversation that's happening now that I don't remember happening before 2015, Fees Must Fall. So that moment of rupture in which young women came into the arena had really, for me, rich impact for debates about African feminisms, what they actually means in theoretical terms and in material terms. Yeah, let me stop there.
That's fantastic. Siphokazi, you and I were both witness to all the nods and the smiles of appreciation from the audience for this work. Thank you very much for bringing this project to STIAS, for being part of this cohort of fellows. I think all of them, us at STIAS included, really look forward to spending the rest of this semester with you as you progress through this material and think along the kinds of questions that we've heard. You're all invited to keep following the work of STIAS. There will be a post of this lecture on our website, so share that with others, invite them to be part of the conversation, and thanks for all the questions. Finally, thanks Siphokazi for the talk.